Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living world and with the great mystery that runs through us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and daring natures, bringing together the expansive minds, topics, and ideas that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we wish to thrive in.
For me, the visceral experience of being associated in wilderness areas is being out your comfort zone and recognising there are forces greater than humans can harness. And you get that whenever you're in a wild place. You get that when you're in the high seas. You get that when you're in the Arctic. You get that when you're on the plains of the Serengeti or whatever. But you get it in spades when you're down in the Antarctic.
This is a conversation with Damon Stanwell-Smith, who has the most incredible array of experiences in the wilderness as a marine biologist and scientific expedition leader. He spent 3 years on the British Antarctic Survey base and since became an expert in remote location research management in polar, temperate, and tropical environments. He has worked in international marine consultancy for the United Nations Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Centre and was also the executive director of the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators. He is now head of science and sustainability for the Norwegian company Viking, where he has spent the past 2 years creating first-of-their-kind expedition ships. I'm simply in awe of Damon and his work and grounded perspective in this world. He's not afraid to look at and speak about the complexities and sometimes hypocrisies of conservational work, and just has such vast experience and insight around the challenges of human nature when it comes to protecting our environment. He guides us through his journey into this work and what continues to call him back again and again to Antarctica, sharing some hair-raising tales from the ice along the way.
To tell a story of this, I am 51 years old, and so my memory is fading. Everything before the age of 18 is a bit of a blur, but the collective memory of being a child was that I was desperate to be involved with the sea. I've felt that in my bones ever since the earliest visceral memories have been a connection with the sea. For me, the sea represented the wild, it represented the outdoors, it represented freedom, it represented something about the natural world that I couldn't even put in words as a child, but I just knew that viscerally I needed it in the same way that I needed to eat or drink. And so I have had a career that was shaped very much from childhood of being actually a sea scout. So playing around with boats and playing around with the water and playing around with all things to do with nauticalia, if you will. Even though actually I didn't grow up by the sea. I knew it despite having not lived literally alongside the sea. It then expressed itself in as I was choosing careers. And my first career choice was to join the Royal Marines. And I thought maybe the best way to go to sea was to go to sea as a fighter. But it was a way of having adventure and so on. And I went through that process of working out how I should do that, and indeed made my choices about where I'd go to university and looking for a bursary and all that sort of thing through the Royal Navy. And I had an epiphany. And that epiphany was during a time I was travelling between school and university. I travelled in Southeast Asia and then in Australia. And I realised that it wasn't the military that it was the key hook, it was how the natural world engaged. And I made the very challenging decision a few weeks before my university started. I telephoned the university and I said, I'd like to study marine biology. And I remember that day very clearly because it was a conscious decision to make a professional choice as to how to do something associated with the sea. I then I went to university. I had a fun time studying marine biology, which is a career path that many people have taken, and it wasn't extraordinary. It was just a wonderful time. And then the next stage came along was the opportunity, really, that marine biology is often sneered at as a vocation by others doing more, should we say, serious disciplines, as just having a bit of fun. And so my next stage is that I read a book by John Steinbeck. It's called The Log of the Sea of Cortez. It's about Mexico. And the story is of an expedition run during World War II, about getting a boat together and doing a marine biological adventure in Mexico, in Baja California, or the Sea of Cortez. And in it, John Steinbeck, who did a marine biology degree at Stanford, by the way, he's a marine biologist before he became an author. He explained in beautiful terms that it's okay to have fun when you're in the wild places. And it completely transformed the way I saw the world. Instead of being slightly embarrassed whenever I said I was doing anything on a coral reef or when I was planning to take a boat somewhere, people would tease. He very, in beautiful words, says, it's okay, it's okay to enjoy science. It's okay to be in the natural world and to be working. And for me, that was the turning point. At that point, I said, well, I can make this my profession. I can earn money from doing this. I don't just do this for fun. And so I then realised that the nature of doing an expedition, which is a very interesting thing we could unpack, if you like, of what an expedition is. For example, the famous Norwegian expeditioner Roald Amundsen described adventure as adventure is just bad planning. That you can make as much adventure as you like if you want to be as ill-prepared as you wish. And so expeditions in the context of going to remote places and having some purpose to do that is what I have always been interested in. And so I then progressed, and we can unpack in terms of chronology of various places I've worked in, and I've always made it my work. And so as a brief chronology of what I've done, I left university and I looked around to say, where was the coolest expedition around? What was the biggest thing operational? And it was the British Antarctic Survey at the time. So I joined the British Antarctic Survey as a marine biologist and as a professional scuba diver. And so the early part of my career, the first 5 years of my professional career, was spent both living in Antarctica for 3 years and then writing a PhD about my experiences and work in Cambridge in the UK. And from there, I then got the taste and indeed had the government, should we say, I had the opportunity of the government paying for me to get lots of nice skills that are quite useful and difficult to get otherwise. And I then leveraged that into where I could go elsewhere. So the day I finished my Antarctic work, my contract, at midday, by 9 p.m. I was on an aeroplane to Mozambique. And I went then to East Africa to join an expeditionary organisation, an NGO that was working there, an Anglo-Mozambican NGO. And then I spent the next few years working in East Africa. And this was just a few years after the terrible civil war that was fought there. And it was wild in its own way. And we can cover that if you're interested. I then came home from there and I ended up managing the research for an expeditionary organisation in a variety of places. And I had 5 years of just zipping from place to place, troubleshooting. If I was coming, it normally meant something was going wrong. I very rarely flew anywhere to go, hey, everybody, you're just having a great time. And for me, that was about understanding the rigour of being in difficult places. And so on one hand, I really appreciate that it is fun to be in wild places, but then there is a self-indulgence that can eat at people of being in a wild place, having fun when the people that live there locally are not having quite so much fun. And it is a tough time to be in remote places if you're of modest income and difficult environment to work in and live in. And so it focused my mind to say, how could I substantively, ethically and appropriately work in these places alongside the people that live in them. And so I continued in that vein for 5 years doing that. And I feel that of its time, this was working mostly in environmental education and mobilising local resources to be able to empower and upskill local people. Although I'd like to revisit that later, actually, because I've changed my view from the time, this is the 1990s, through to now. I then returned to the UK and I got involved in UK-based things. I was very interested in how I could take what I'd learnt overseas and apply to the more local remote places, if that makes sense. Specifically around how to look at the underwater reef environments, and I worked with the Welsh Government. In fact, I had an 8-year contract with what was then called the Countryside Council for Wales, is now called Natural Resources Wales. And this was running the scuba diving, the underwater surveying work associated with protecting the coast of Wales. And that is very seasonal. And when it's seasonal, in the summertime, you're out in the waters and it's all wonderful. In the wintertime, it's pretty dull. You're just gathering, looking at data and everything else. And at that point, this is 2003, I was looking around for a way to remain engaged with the natural world. And I discovered that there is a market for people that know what they're doing and how to manage risk, paying guests to these far off places on ships. So I started doing that in the wintertime in the Indian Ocean and then to Antarctica. And given that the Antarctic season where you can access the place is the northern winter, it's known as the austral summer, I was able to start travelling down there as a guide and then later as an expedition leader. And I continued doing that for 5 years as well. And then I was in Iceland, and this is where sometimes hard reality hits. I was in Iceland the day that the banks went bust in Iceland. There were 2 banks that went bust in October 2008. And we were sailing from Iceland to Greenland on an icebreaker, and I had a lot of Icelandic people on board who were on holiday, and we were about to have an adventure in Greenland and going off across the Atlantic over to Labrador and Newfoundland. And I sort of had a second epiphany of saying, this is difficult because this is quite self-indulgent going to these wild places. And I think the self-indulgence is very much the human condition of being in remote places and worth thinking about. And so I looked around and thought, where is going to be the safest place to work? And I chose the United Nations. And at the time, it just seemed a swift option. Actually, in retrospect, it was probably quite a good plan. And so I joined a body called the World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And when I was there, I was given responsibility for monitoring biodiversity for the world, the global biodiversity, of how to track every nation's biodiversity trends towards what was then called the International Year of Biodiversity, which is 2010. And what I transferred was the transferable skill of being able to run a ship through to how to run an awful lot of academics to kind of be on the same page. And so that was a real pivot from looking at the wilderness from within, as opposed to taking the helicopter view, literally. How far back can you go to look at the whole world? And that really, again, changed the way I saw the natural world. And that work, such that it was, as a process, was successful. As a storyline, was a terrible story of failure. In 2010, it was perceived that about half of the natural world had disappeared since 1970, which is the year of my birth, which in a 40-year period is obviously catastrophic. So at that point, I then thought, how do I get back to my first love? And that's the seas. So I pushed for and was promoted to being the head of the marine programme of the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, which meant I had a period where all of the data that's about the sea was literally my responsibility in terms of biodiversity. So all the data around global coral reefs and mangroves and salt marshes and other biota, which was a position of responsibility, but also of great influence in a nice way. And at the same time, it is also very frustrating, as has been commented very recently. There was there are large swathes of the population, and indeed, in particular, those that are professionally involved with climate change, are traumatized by what is going on. They can see that the world is sort of heading towards the crash barriers, and they don't know professionally how to shout into the darkness to say, watch out. And that is equally the case when it comes to understanding biodiversity, the variety of life on Earth. And again, we can unpack that. And for me, I found that you can take that on for so long, and so I had 6.5 years of doing that. And actually, for me, it was emotionally traumatic to be involved in something that you feel that you're influencing, but the pace is so slow, and working in that intergovernmental space. And I confess that candidly, I felt that I'd almost like given all that I could give at that time without becoming jaded. And so I then moved to a Danish consultancy where I thought I could have more utility. And what we were doing there was working on how to consent offshore wind power. And in fact, I gave a talk when I left the UN. I worked out how much carbon I'd burnt in the name of conservation. I'd worked in workshops in 85 countries. I'd flown to meetings multiple times in 46 countries. And I thought, there's a little bit of a paradox here. So maybe I had a period of offsetting that by looking at how to get offshore wind consented. This is around the coast of the UK, where there's more offshore wind than the rest of the world put together at the time. This is and then to come to full circle, as this sort of extended intro of chronology of where I've been in my engagement with the wilderness, is I was approached a few years ago to lead the body that self-manages. It's a regulatory body for the private sector visiting on expeditions to the Antarctic. And it was too good a job to turn down. So I led that regulatory body, that authority, for a few years. And that gave me, again, a different take on it. That gave me a take on the wilderness from the perspective of how do we take non-specialists in the same way that I travelled at the beginning of my career to an extraordinary space, which I would like to dwell on because there is nowhere like Antarctica. And then to come right to the present day, 2.5 years ago, when I was enjoying this job with IATO, I was made a proposition by a Norwegian shipping company called Viking of an idea of how to undertake scientifically focused expeditions on vessels specifically built for the purpose in Antarctica and other remote regions, where to be as responsible as it's possible to be, to reimagine what a ship like this can do. And that, again, was too good an opportunity to turn down. And so this is what I do right now, and I'm the head of science for Viking Expeditions. And it's very timely because in a few weeks' time, we are finally setting off. Through lockdown, we've built 2 ships. We've designed a whole program, which I can elaborate on in this conversation, which is in the relation to how people can engage with the natural world.
Wow. Thank you for that incredible introduction and journey through your working life. It's truly remarkable, and you've touched upon so many things that we could dive into that I'm trying to think where's best to go first. You've spoken about conservation and also being at the table, with World Conservation Monitoring and the UN Environmental Programme, and talking about the pace, the lack of pace in those places. And I guess I'd like to go towards what actually works. There's a lot of companies in general that are just using greenwashing campaigning and using that as an additional way to market things, and it's really actually not offering a solution. Coca-Cola obviously comes to mind with their recyclable plastics, but they're not providing any resources to actually recycle these plastics in all of these places. And obviously there's loads of huge giants doing this. And so from being in a space of really being there to consult on conservation and preservation, what actually works? Like, what is the hope?
From a hope point of view is a very interesting one. When I distill hope, I think of Greta Thunberg. She's the Joan of Arc of our time. And when I see her berating the UN as a child, as a 15, 16-year-old, saying, I don't believe you. I'm watching. To me, that's hope. And most recently in Glasgow, when she's saying blah, blah, blah and whatever, she has an uncommon gift of distilling a voice of a generation. So I'm of the view that humans move in sort of generational jumps. We rarely change overnight. In my lifetime, I think the biggest change I've seen came after 9/11, the terror attacks in 2001 in the US. Is that, for me, I remember that ground shift in the way that we saw. There was a shift, not just because of the USA, but just a shift in the way that we understood what it was to travel in different places and different peoples and so on. There was a real schism between different worldviews. As a teenager, I remember feeling the same way, but I don't know whether it affected everybody in the same way. But as a 16-year-old, I recall Chernobyl. I remember the nuclear meltdown and just that feeling of that nuclear power is problematic, catastrophic. And of course, we've come full circle, because now, in a different generation, nuclear is seen as an example because it's relatively less producing of CO2. I mean, it might produce nuclear waste, but at the moment we're thinking CO2 is and increasing CO2 in the atmosphere is worse than creating nuclear waste that has to go down a hole and be dealt with over 10,000 years. So in a human lifetime, and of course in my just 51 years on Earth, I can see these turning points, but I don't see substantive change. And maybe only if we took the long-term view, if we were looking at it as if we were something like a baobab tree, a 4,000-year baobab tree, might look at it differently than a human does with our 70, 80 years or whatever worldview. So to your question of hope, I think hope comes that there are generations coming behind us, the young ones now, who are going to look at what we've done and said, you are bonkers, you are vandals, and I believe that's where hope is. I know I'm part of a generation that have really stuffed things up. And although in my personal way, I can self-justify that I wasn't literally at the tiller at the handle, on the handle of the tiller, but I recognise that, for what it's worth, the work on conservation that I was doing previously, I was flying around to do it. I recognise that meddling in other places that then creates resentment isn't always the way to engage in wild places and to steer towards what seem to be conservation ideals. And then the second level of hope is, I think there has been a shift in the way conservation is undertaken. And in fact, there's an organisation based in Cambridge, as it happens, or it could be anywhere, that is called Conservation Evidence. And one of the things that has always troubled me is that we come up with a good idea and we go, yes, we've got to do this, a bit like with education, without evidence that it's any better than the past. And so conservation, I think, has struggled from trying to do the greatest, latest thing, with all the best intention. It's not to say that people are cynical. And without the evidence to do so. So the body Conservation Evidence, which is run through Cambridge, become a bit of an international movement, distills out everything that's ever been done in different areas of conservation and worked out how well it worked. And so a second level of hope is that basis of saying, well, let's look at what works and then try to do more of it, to me is a part of the practical solution. I don't think it's the only solution, but it's a practical solution. And then to speak to your question about corporations and the private sector, I don't see a cleavage line between the public sector and the private sector, in my view. I see a cleavage line between being responsible and irresponsible. And you singled out Coca-Cola. I can't make a comment specifically. I don't know enough about how Coca-Cola operate, but I'm aware that greenwashing is a thing, and I'm aware that there's many, many corporations that can do it. But what I also see is greenwashing from governments and from charities and from academics and so on. And so the principle of ends justifying the means, where whatever activity that you are involved with, you try to justify. I am sure that not everybody that made cigarettes thought they were killing people. They thought, well, actually, I'm supplying a demand and I'm making nice product and it tastes nice or whatever. I don't know. But however, the overall effect is that, as you know, we've known for the last 100 years, is that cigarettes are very harmful. So greenwash for me is about, sometimes it is deliberate, in which it's more than insincerity, it's disingenuous and problematic. Sometimes I think it is naivety, where people genuinely think, who are running businesses, that the actions that they are taking somehow mitigate against the ways that it's, if we were to sort of stray off piste a little bit, it's like the justification of people having children. That one of the things alongside this is, for example, how many people there are. You know, when there's more people, there are, and I'm not taking a view on what's right or wrong. I'm just saying that typically, if someone has a large family, there will be a personal justification of why there are more children in the family or whatever, that's based on love and family values and what have you. And then there are others that have chosen not to have children, others that can't, and so on. And there'll be a justification, whatever. And so one tends to justify all actions according to the frame of reference that makes you feel okay about it. So I don't think it's as easy as saying that all corporations are out to be mean and that all governments are trying to do the right thing. I actually genuinely think that that problematically, we work in an environment and we work in a political environment where short-term decisions are made, because just as famously President Obama once said, is that everybody's winging it. I think everybody's working out how to get through tomorrow or next month or next year, and that 10 years from now can wait. And to me, that is the biggest challenge. Humans are like goldfish.
Yeah, that's very valid. And yeah, I see how that is the biggest challenge. At the end of the day, we all have to keep ourselves afloat and focus on the next thing, and then we all have our own standards of what is relative to our own successes and culturally and all of that. You briefly touched upon this. I don't know whether we should go here, but obviously the conflict that can arise with doing conservation overseas, and I've heard about this kind of almost colonial perspective of like, this is how we do it, this is what needs to be done, and not taking in people into the conservation, which, we need to see the whole package. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
I feel very strongly about this, actually, and I've also, in my own small way, have witnessed this in the long term. So as a young professional, having had the benefit of an academic training associated in biology and to an extent conservation, but without the wisdom associated, I looked to exercise that in the opportunities that were presented. And I think that it is routinely a challenge that when taking theory and applying it, and essentially if you're a young professional, you by definition it's only theory, you've only got other people's experience. And when turning up in places where things are being done, let's say, for example, going to somewhere where there's routine deforestation or overfishing or whatever, turning up and saying, oh, you can do different. There is actually, in my opinion, a surprising willingness to listen to people that are perceived to have had academic training in this. And it's a willingness that then becomes jaded, because if it was that easy, we'd all be doing it. And I don't think it is easy to work out these challenges in complex places. And on a personal level, I had the experience when I was in the UN system to go back to the countries where I had been working in an NGO. So turning up 10, 15 years later and meeting many of the people that I work with who were also junior scientists and so on at the time, who then progressed through the ranks and ended up in government in their respective countries that we're working with, who remember those days. And they remember, on one hand, they remember the learnings and the opportunities and so on. But typically when you visit somewhere away, you're there for a little while and then you leave. The whole of funding, project cycles, typically is 2, 3, 5 years of funding, and with very rarely a legacy on that. And then you spend the money somewhere, you get something going, and then you leave. And so the perspective of being left behind, the people that are there the whole time, it's their home, it's their heritage, it's their family home, and so on, routinely become embittered. And they just become jaded. It's like, well, there's all these foreigners coming in telling us what to do. And then they'll look at their own countries and say, well, maybe, if things had been done differently in Britain or somewhere else in the Western Europe or whatever, or the US or whatever, 100 years ago, they wouldn't be quite so interested in meddling where we are. And it comes back to the human condition, which I'm very interested in about the open sea. And the human condition I see is that people don't like being told what to do. And the instinct of many humans is to do different. And in fact, the closest university, apart from Cambridge where I live in Cambridge in the UK, but up the road is in Norwich, is the University of East Anglia. And its motto is do different, which I always think makes me smile wryly. Because doing different is the human instinct, but it isn't always the instinct to do better. And if we are mindful of saying nobody likes being told what to do, I have occasionally seen how that can be manifested and utilised in a really positive way. And to give you one anecdote, one specific. One of the real visionaries in conservation that I've ever worked with is a man called Sir Bob Watson. And he was chief advisor to the UK government, to DEFRA, on science and conservation. And he, in fact, was in the Obama administration, I believe, as well in the US. He's an extraordinary character, a real wise old owl. And in 2011, the UK, rarely for the UK is ahead of the curve on anything to do with the natural world and conservation, developed something called the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. I know about it because the Secretariat for developing it was in the building in the World Conservation Monitoring Centre where I was working at the time. And one of the key points that was made at the time, and I have chosen to bring this into my own work since, is that Bob Watson said, we're not going to write recommendations, which is the normal thing. And any time you're writing a report with any sort of advice on it, you write a bit of a report about the state of play and then you give recommendations. And he said the same thing. He said, nobody likes being told what to do. He said, I'm going to present options. And so he painted pictures of options and he gave them names. He described the green and pleasant land option. He described the business as usual option. He described the business is king option or whatever. And it was a really interesting way of working because you're just saying, look, there are these different scenarios and you're resisting the urge to say, well, we really ought to go down this one. We're just painting pictures, telling stories. And that report that came out was phenomenally successful in changing opinion. And a white paper on the environment came out within 6 weeks, which is the fastest time that any white paper on the environment's ever come out, I believe. I might have got the numbers wrong, but certainly it was very rapidly. And it is credited with really shifting the British political class view on the natural world within the UK. And I am convinced that it's partly because of Bob Watson's wisdom as the chief advisor to that massive process, was to not try to tell what needs to be done.
That's amazing. Thank you for that anecdote. And I feel like that can be transferred into so many things in life. I would love to dive into your experience in Antarctica and go into your relationship there with the wilderness and explore how this has shaped you as a human and defined your sense of place in the world. And you might refer to experiences in other types of wilderness, but yeah, I'm curious if you have any stories to share to give us a flavour of the wonders of this part of the world also.
Well, absolutely. And there are many wildernesses, but there's nowhere like Antarctica. And I'll just explain why, in my view. Firstly, we live in a world of nearly 8 billion people. And the Antarctic continent is the size of North America, as in the US and Canada combined. And we as humans haven't yet managed to work out how to live there yet. So we talk about living on a crowded planet, but there's a whole continent that just happens to be tucked at the bottom that we've yet to engage with. We've scratched the surface. There is, at the moment, 27 countries who run Antarctic bases around the Antarctic continent, and a total of perhaps maybe 1,000 people spend time year-round there, adding up all of the people. There's more in the summertime, but in the wintertime, which is if you like, most of the time down there, is about 8 months of the year, there's maybe 1,000 people down there in a continent the size of North America. And when I say that, even 30 years after I first had the opportunity to engage with the place, it still brings up hairs on the back of my neck. And that is because it is like travelling back in time. So when you go to Antarctica, it is like going to the time when, maybe 2 million years ago, when humans were not anywhere, and that it is entirely natural. And so going to Antarctica is not about necessarily the fact it's penguins and snowy and icy and all the rest of it. It's a visceral experience. You're going to somewhere that humans haven't yet worked out how to go to. It's like going to Mars. And I would suggest that no one's ever gone and been ambivalent. Some people don't like it because it's all those things. It's the coldest, it's the windiest, it's the highest. There's a lot of superlative. But no one's ever gone and gone, meh. Most people that go are profoundly effective in a positive way. They say, wow, this is just extraordinary. And the second element of that wilderness place is that there's no indigenous population. There never has been. So no humans call it home. As such, everybody is a visitor. And we're touching upon this idea that when you're meddling with somebody else's space, it's the only place on Earth where you're genuinely meddling with an entire ecosystem that humans have never had a chance to meddle in. We've tried our best, or worst, if you want to look at it that way, in the last 200 years. Because the Antarctic was only sort of officially discovered, although that's a planted debate, 201 years ago. It was 1820 was when it was first sort of mapped and sighted and visited. So it's only 200 years, the universe is 13 billion years old, the world is 4.5 billion years old, and we only found Antarctica 200 years ago. It's like, how do we miss it? To me, the visceral experience of being associated in wilderness areas is being out your comfort zone and recognising there are forces greater than humans can harness. And you get that whenever you're in a wild place. You get that when you're in the high seas. You get that when you're in the Arctic. You get that when you're on the plains of the Serengeti or whatever. But you get it in spades when you're down in the Antarctic.
That's amazing. Yeah, I can only imagine. And you've spent so much time under the sea as well. And that's an experience I don't know if I'll be able to do in this lifetime. It would be wonderful to explore at some point, but it's certainly daunting for the average person. And I was just wondering if you could share your perspective around that as well. Again, how has that shaped you, this underworld?
I mean, and you're right, it's a great privilege to be able to go underwater. And although, funnily enough, I do very much self-identify as a diver and someone that is very familiar with the underwater, in reality, we all just scratch the surface, literally and metaphorically. Humans going underwater, the average depth of the oceans is 4 kilometres depth, 4,000 metres. Most submarines, even military ones, can only go 300 or 400 metres down. There's a few research submarines that can get down to the real depths that we know about, the right to the bottom of the ocean, down to sort of 11,000 metres. So, with the exception of a few craft, most of the oceans are an unknown place. When we scuba dive and we put, air or whatever on our back and dive down, we're going down maybe 50 or 60 metres. We are literally scratching the surface. If you think about it looking up, if someone was saying, what's the atmosphere like? And we said, well, the first 50 metres are quite nice. Everyone will think you're a bit mad. So given that it is scratching the surface, when we do enter that space, we are very much, I think on one hand, I mean, this is where it gets a little bit maybe metaphysical, is that I am convinced there is ancestral familiarity with being in the water. And there are those that have speculated on the fact that we have a nose that's shaped down, and we have lacking in body hair. We have body fat in positions that make us naturally quite suited to being in the water. We have something called a cold water shock effect, that if you splash water on your face, there's all sorts of physiological things that occur, which I have felt very much when you're diving in the Antarctic. You splash the really cold water on your face in order to get your body ready to go in physiologically, and it's an important part of the safety of being underwater there. So I don't know where I stand on that. I know it's controversial, but I feel that I have felt that physiological effect. So for me, it's consistent with my personal experience. But for those that can get underwater in any way, that's wild swimming, that's snorkeling, that's scuba diving, that's going in a submersible, that's being even in one of those tunnels when you're in an aquarium and you look up at the sea, or it's looking through a glass bottom boat, even just going in a swimming bath, engaging with water, I think is very important part of the human interaction. To that end, I think that it is very calming for me. And whilst over in my career I've had a few challenges in diving, I was a works diver for a long time, so inevitably there are things that go wrong. Sometimes equipment fails, sometimes you get out of shape when it comes to the external environment or currents or work that's going on. But the vast majority of all the diving I've ever done, I have a collective, a bit like a childhood sunny memory of it just being a happy space. And to slightly open that out, and again, maybe go down a rabbit hole, but just to put it out there, maybe your listeners might be interested in this, is that I'm convinced that there are two sorts of people that engage with the water when scuba diving. There are those that feel that happiness and that everything is easy, and all the training and everything else you naturally do. And then there is another group of people who seem to be fighting it, who are often the best trained because they want to be well trained, they have amazing equipment. And I secretly suspect, although it's a little bit of a delicate subject to ask these people, that they are fighting a demon, and that, in my estimation, maybe half the people I've encountered professionally diving, and I don't mean clients at the diving school, I mean people whose job it is, for work, are not the people in their happy place. They are doing it because they are confronting something. And the same with recreational divers that are often the ones doing it to the deepest and the pushing it and whatever. And to me, it's a very interesting, I've not looked at it except I've just been aware of it. And it's sort of a private thoughts feeling. Because whether or not you're fighting it or you're embracing it, the wilderness is one of those draws. Sometimes we're drawn to that we would be conflicted by. A little bit like people that are scared of heights that still go bungee jumping or hang gliding or free diving or whatever.
Yes, I resonate with that a lot. I know that I personally have had a lot of fear of the deep water from a young age. And I was riddled with these nightmares of drowning down a well, which I'm convinced was some sort of ancestral or past life trauma. And I've also had these magical dreams of being out in the ocean with humpback whales or dolphins. And yeah, I don't know if I'll ever experience this in waking life. But I would love it if you could share some of your real life tales from under the water, whether they're scary ones or magical ones, not to scare people away, but just to have a taste of some of the adventures from your time at sea.
It's funny when telling tales about these things. It's not trying to be all super scary or whatever, but what you're describing, I mean, if you like talking of cleavage lines in diving, when you're in the water, you know that escape is up. So you know that typically, if you want to get away from this watery place you're in, is that you go up. And so when you're diving under ice, which is one of those cleavage lines, whether you're diving without a closed surface or when you do have a closed surface, and this applies also to cave divers and similar, you know that up is not an option, and it changes your relationship with what you're doing. And so for me, the big divide has been between being in closed surface diving or in normal, regular, open water. And so the most profound experiences I've had have been under sea ice. And when you know that you can't escape, there's no plan B. So plan A is enjoy it, because if you don't, you can't get out. I'll give you two reflections from a long time ago, but they both occurred in the Antarctic. We used to dig holes in ice using a chainsaw in the places that were over the sites that I needed to visit for my science. And my research work at the time was looking at the life history, the life cycles of all the benthic invertebrates, so the seafloor life that didn't move around, and the larvae that they produce and how they colonise and how they spread around. That was what my research was with the British Antarctic Survey in my PhD. And so I had to go to sites to where I had settlement panels, which was little blocks of stone to see what would settle on them, and then we could have a look what grew there. And this was before GPSs were. This is at the very beginning of GPSs, early 1990s. And we were testing GPSs and so on. Now we take for granted that everything from the size of a peanut up, you can work out exactly where it is in space. But in a time when you had to use a compass and you had to use transits and you had to use more simple tools, it's surprising how easy it is to lose things that are underwater, even though you ought to know where they are. We used to cut holes in the ice and then dive down and assume that we were in the right place. And some of these sites didn't have references on the surface. They were all underwater. And at one particular time, we cut a hole, dived down to a site that was quite deep for us, and it was an awful long way away from the dive hole. And we had long lines attached to us, and one of the two divers underwater was attached to a line, and the other one was swimming free. And typically, the dive support person, who would be the person on the line, and the scientist would not be tied on. They just had to make sure they were next to the dive support person. So I was swimming freely underwater, under the ice, with my colleague who was attached to a long line, and we kept swimming. We swam for about 20 minutes in the direction we thought was the right direction. Every stroke we took, we were going further and further away from the hole that we needed to get back to. And the line kept on longer and longer and longer. What we did not know on the surface, as they were adding line, they going, oh my goodness, this is a really long way. We have to attach another line and keep going, keep going, keep going. And it got to the point that we found the dive site and the line was taut, or near as damn it, taut, up to the surface. It just disappeared off into the blue, almost horizontally. The dive support person signaled that he couldn't go any further. And the line to the distance to the site was about another 3 or 4 meters. And I had to make a decision at that point. Do I swim on or do I stay? And if I swim on, in order for him to get me, if I have a problem, he'll have to cut the line. And if he cuts the line, we don't know how to get out. But on the other hand, if I don't do this, I need to get these samples and I had to take a measure of risk. Our equipment used to routinely fail. And when it failed, we had a way of escaping up and so on. It was no problem. But if it failed with a good 20, 25 minute swim home, I definitely wouldn't get back to the surface. We had no spare air on us and so on. It was just the way that the professional scuba diving was set up at that time in the British Antarctic Survey. So I swam on. I took a decision and I swam on and I found our site. And I remember, and I had to, the time on site with the time it took to take a series of photographs. In those days, it was a film camera that had 36 shots. And each time I took a photograph, there were some big flash guns that had to recharge themselves. It took about 7 or 8 seconds to recharge. So you can do the maths. It was like 8 seconds times by 36. So there's a period of time, there's a few minutes on site. But every second of those times I can remember, because I was looking to see to make sure I knew where the support diver was. I was hyper conscious of what I was breathing. And I was in that moment thinking every second I have to make sure that it's okay, because if it goes wrong, I have to be on the cusp of knowing it's going to go wrong, because we're going to have to swim out of here. If it starts going wrong, we're really in trouble. Anyway, I got the photos. And then I came back to Rob, the diving officer, and he was quite pleased that I was back because he was there looking after me, and he was like, you can imagine what he was thinking. We swam out, and it was an awfully long swim back, and we came up, and there was a pandemonium going on the surface because the number of lines, they didn't know where we were. Just all these lines had disappeared, which is completely unprecedented in the diving. So we measured how far we had gone, and we called the American Antarctic base that was nearby us that evening, and we told them what had happened. And they were going, "Oh my guys, you've just broken the world record for the furthest swim underneath the Antarctic ice." And we didn't even know there was a record. And it's not the kind of world record that's going to make it's because it's pretty esoteric what's going on in Antarctic diving. But it was nice to have pushed the boundary of what was possible on scuba at the time. It gave us an insight into what it was, but only after the fact. We would never have planned to do that. That would have been highly inappropriate in a professional operation to go and try and break a world record in order to do something. The risk that, it would be factored out, we wouldn't even got close. That was inadvertently pushing physiological boundaries, or at least what's possible in terms of adventure. And to quote Amazon again, adventure is just bad planning. You could say we had a great adventure because we did not plan very well. On another dive, I was at a site quite deep with another scientist who was working on seaweeds. And she was at the depth where light gets down. So it was and light gets a long way into Antarctic waters. So the seaweeds are quite deep, about 32 metres down. She had a problem with her regulator, which is her breathing apparatus, which is, as I said, it was a common thing. About 10% of the dives, we had a problem with our breathing apparatus. We had a standard procedure. We came face to face, and we were going to go up together, monitoring the breathing of her failing. It was failing, but not failing in a way that stopped her breathing. We started rising, and all of a sudden, I was pulled away like I was a rag doll, shaken around, flip, flop, all over the place. And I didn't know where my dive partner was. I didn't know what was going on. And in my mind's eye, all I was thinking was that the bubbles of her breathing apparatus were coming to the surface, and they'd have come into the small square hole, that's about a metre square, and bubbling through. And maybe the person on the end of the line was pulling us up in a hurry, panicking. Anyway, I got to the surface and I started shouting at the linesman saying, "Oh, you're trying to kill me. What's on earth's going on?" And he was saying, no, apologise. And then I couldn't see where my dive partner was. There was a scientist called Patty, a Dutch scientist. As I climbed out, the people on the surface could see that everything behind my head had all been chewed up. All the rope and everything had been attacked. Patty then appeared in the hole about a minute later, which was a very long minute while we were hoping that she was coming up. And she climbed out the water, and she was okay. She was relieved to get out. And as she was sitting on the dive hole, we were just saying, having that sort of relieved conversation. A leopard seal, which is 4 meters long, with a great big head. They're the apex predator of the Antarctic, like the tiger of the Antarctic, slipped up through the hole, pushed her thighs apart, and just sat in front of her, nose to her, maybe 15, 20 centimeters. And if you ask your viewers, have a look at what a leopard seal looks like, the head is disproportionately big. And just looked at her, and for 30 seconds, it felt like about a year, and then just slipped into the water. We, of course, were well away. And then she climbed out, and we're like, wow. And when we break down what had happened, clearly the bubbles. So when you breathe open circuit scuba, which is the bubbles that you breathe on normal breathing apparatus, it's actually a threat response to marine mammals. So you're sending out a constant message of come on then, do you think you're hard enough, sort of thing. And which is why film crew, when they're filming marine mammals underwater, tend to use what are called rebreathers or snorkels. So there's no bubbles blowing everywhere. And so clearly we were sending out some threat posturing, especially with the bubbling going on with Patty's breathing apparatus failing. And this leopard seal had taken it into their own hands and had shaken me around to sort of remind me who's boss. And we were just, I wasn't hurt. It was just a bit of a panicky time. To give you a little postscript, up to that point, it is my understanding it was the most full-on leopard seal interaction that any scuba diver had in Antarctica. And this was in 1993 or 94. Well, in 2003, the person doing my job in Antarctica was snorkeling down there, taking some pictures, and she was grabbed by a leopard seal, but instead of being shaken around, she was dragged down to 75 metres down and drowned. So, which remains the only fatality associated with leopard seals. And she was doing the same job as me, just 10 years on, the marine biologist job at the Antarctic base, in Rothera Base in the Antarctic Peninsula. And that was obviously a very sad postscript. So, that not to be taken lightly, in a way, in retrospect. I only found that out obviously years later. I was involved actually with an investigation afterwards, just thinking about leopard seal behaviour in divers. Of course, we were naive in the 90s and we didn't know that they could be so dangerous.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing those two tales from under the ice. And it's so tragic to hear about that woman 10 years later. We have this human condition of thinking we're invincible. And when we're deep out in the wilderness, we're not fully equipped for survival all the time. So, gosh, what a life. What a life. Could you share a little bit about the biodiversity that you were researching under the ice and that you were perhaps unknowingly risking your life for?
Well, we didn't set out to risk our lives. I mean, it was, but in terms of the, if you like, interestingly, the word biodiversity is, but just as a preamble to just talking about the Antarctic biodiversity. In 2010, in the International Year of Biodiversity, a survey across the European member states, 47% of respondees, of thousands of people that responded, thought that biodiversity was a washing powder. If you think of biodiversity in its simplest form is complexity. What we know of the natural world on the whole, instinctively, I think, is that complex systems are resilient, are protected against things that change. When we look at a field of corn, we know that it's growing, but I think even a child might instinctively say, if the wind blew, that would all go, or if there was a bug that the corn didn't like, it would kill it all, or whatever. In contrast to looking at a tropical forest, or indeed, even just any sort of tangled environment where all those different niches, all those different plants and animals interacting together are complex, and that complexity protects it. The Antarctic has been isolated for an awful long time. It has been at least 35 million years. It's been separated from the rest of the planet, and it's been very cold. And so, specifically in the Antarctic, there is plants and animals that have evolved to being very adapted to being cold and isolated. And so it has had the resilience to do so. The biodiversity of the Antarctic is very much all about cold adaptation. And the extremes of things are what make it most difficult for plants and animals to live anywhere. And when you're above the sea, it's much more extreme, as in the colds are colder and maybe the winds are windier and so on. But certainly the colds, the coldest record of anywhere on the planet was recorded in Antarctica. It's minus 89 Celsius at Vostok Station in Russia, or Russian station Vostok, actually. Whereas because of the extraordinary buffering effect of seawater, of water, and specifically seawater, the coldest that the sea ever gets down there is -2 or -1.9 to be precise, Celsius. And so whilst it is cold, it isn't really cold. And so the paradox of going diving there, for example, as a human being, is that it can be damn cold on the surface. It can be -35 on the surface, and you're thinking, when I get in, it's a bit warmer. Knowing that when you get in under the ice, it's always the same. It's about -2. And the same goes for the life under the planet, under the ice, rather. On the surface, there's very little living on the ice and snow. There's a few mites, little arachnid type, a bit like tiny spiders. And there are birds, seabirds, and there's coastal animals like penguins and so on, as you're aware. But under the sea, it's a riot of colour. It's brightly coloured like a coral reef. So there's all the sponges and the holothurians and the sea cucumbers and the sea stars and the sea urchins and the all the different biota there. Bright riot of pinks and yellows and greens and so on. actually more colourful than a coral reef that we traditionally associate. I mean, a typical coral reef is actually mostly brown, but it's got really colourful fish on it. In Antarctica, the seabed itself, the static life that's growing is all the bright colours, and then there's not many fish. So it is biodiverse under the water, much more so than above it, simply because there is stability. You know, people talk about climate change. It's the word change that's the big bit. It's not the climate as such. We, not just we as humans, we as all things alive, don't cope with change so well, rapid change.
And do you have a particular take on climate change and the rising sea levels?
My take is humans are problem solvers. I don't think they're strategic. To that end, we have created problems for ourselves, and we're going to now face them. So the sea levels will rise, I'm sure of it, given that most cities on the planet have been built close to seas because a previous problem was transport. Building a city like Machu Picchu is all very nice, but it's damn difficult to get your supplies in. Well, you know, it's much easier if you're in New York or London or anywhere where there's big ports. And so the paradox is going to be that we solved a different problem then, and the problem then was transport and feeding everybody, getting everything in. Well, now the new problem we're going to face is that we will have to abandon those coastal places. We'll either have to put them on stilts or we're going to have to move inland. And that, I think, is going to be problem number one. And then problem number two is going to be food security. And we're already seeing that. You know, we see the Gamini types are getting excited about a few people coming to Britain and that sort of perceived idea that there's a migration of people moving from different places. But it's always happened. It's happened since the beginning, since humans have moved. I mean, nomads, by definition, were moving people. So the idea of humans, I mean, there's one thing we're pretty good at, is we're good at walking and moving around and building boats and moving around since the beginning of time. The idea that we're all static is not necessarily our natural state. We face that second challenge, as we're all aware, and we're seeing the opening shots of that in the tabloid papers in the UK about migration, and we see that in many other countries. There's going to be that conflict. We will reach a new equilibrium, I suspect. I don't mean to sound fatalistic about it. I just feel that the die is cast. I think that there are things that we consider and we continue to do. I don't want to get too political about this, but I personally feel that the fixation on an increase of 1.5 Celsius is a way of, when non-specialists start talking about it, I'm a little bit uncomfortable when I see people fixating on that specifically. Change is coming. And it always has been. You know, that the past looks like it was static, but we faced other changes. There's always something that humans are having to cope with. So as problem solvers, we'll solve the problems.
Yeah, and you mentioned about not getting political, but I mean, it's going to be hugely political when you think of migration as, like you're saying, you know, a human birthright, an animal birthright, if you have legs or...
It's certainly an instinct. We will do it. Whether or not we have the right to do it is another matter. That's a whole other ballgame. We certainly can do it, and we do. And then there are others that would choose to stop us. To go back to nobody likes being told what to do. When you have irresistible force meets immovable object, you're always going to get fireworks. Well, we're going to have just more of that. If there's one thing that we know as humans is that we can cope with most things, just not everybody comes out the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And we have an increasing population that we're all going to be working on this. So on the one hand, that's more people to move around. On the other, that maybe means there's more people with creative ideas to motivate to do different. I am hopeful. To the point about, you know, earlier I was saying is that there are people that will motivate others to do it. I'm not sure that they are in certainly my generation. Just because the bigger picture says things are unsure, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't enjoy the moment, though. There's a whole issue of mortality there, isn't there? We all know our fate ultimately. It's just how we go about filling in the interim.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the log of the Sea of Cortez and allowing ourselves to enjoy even though there's change.
And
And
that's
yeah.
to me that is so important, and we can enjoy it, and we can enjoy it in a profound way. We can look to do different. We can affect in a smaller scale and globally. You know, we've always lived with the idea that there is suffering in the world, and yet it doesn't mean that we would therefore ignore the suffering on our doorstep. There's always going to be environmental change, but it doesn't mean that we can't try to quite time to change our local the effects locally. Specifically with climate change, the challenge I think is that it's so been fed to everybody that, you know, think local and act local, think global, or whatever, that the information revolution hasn't fully got through, I think. The idea that we're fed this idea that there's no point in doing something locally because how do we affect the big picture? Uniquely, I think we haven't come to terms with the idea that you can affect things locally. There is a school of thought in conservation that, for example, telling people about polar bears dying doesn't resonate because it's so abstract. We see a polar bear; they're really cool, and you know, if you go to the Arctic, you can see magnificent animals and so on. Humans aren't so good on the abstract. The idea that we should, I don't know, not drive our car because of a broader challenge with climate. For many people, I don't think that connection's made. There'll be going back to our earlier point. There'll be a justification. Oh, but actually, I need to go to the shops, or oh, I've got to go and see my mum, or whatever it might be. Squaring that is the human condition. We know we're flawed, aren't we? I think one of the areas of hope and pushing and so on is to say that is if the right incentives are there and the right framework to work in, then improvements can be made too. And so quite often when I look at many of the challenges that we face, even just at a sort of, if you like, at a national scale, one can see that the regulation has not been designed in order to improve matters. You know, the question then goes of who's writing that legislation. And I know that's straying a bit off wilderness, but it's very relevant to how we engage with wilderness, or indeed with the open sea. And I know we touched right at the beginning about open sea, and if to circle around to that and try to tie it into what we're discussing now, one of the appeals of the open sea as a form of wilderness, and certainly one that I feel viscerally, is that when you set off into what is, after all, 70% of the planet is covered in sea, and 58% of that is the high seas, which means there's no laws whatsoever. 58% of our seas are not governed at all. There is a vague thing called the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, but you can go and do what you want in the high seas. And to the point about legislation and about rules and about what you can do, there is no substitute for being somewhere where nobody can tell you what to do. And that is the appeal of the sea. That is why people become deep sea fishing folk. That's why people join ships. That's why people run away to sea. What they're actually doing is they're saying, sod the world. I do not want to be told what to do. And it's the one place where nobody can tell you what to do. I do feel in a world that is so controlled. I don't know if your listeners are in the US, but the paradox often in the US is described as land of the free, but then to the international eye, there's so much control associated with the police and other things. And that paradox, I'm not going to unpack that, but just as an observation. It is a visceral thing to want to be where your decisions stand, where risk is taken. You know, that whether you're just an individual in a little sailing boat, or whether you're the captain of a supertanker, or anything in between. They say that when you're the skipper of a vessel, you're master under God. It depends on your frame of theological reference, but the essence is the same. Is that it goes back right to the beginning of time, isn't it? When you're off there, it's only your decisions. And I find a particular fascination with that. And I think high seas governance is a particularly interesting, knotty challenge. The official term is called Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, ABNJ. It's topical because right now countries are wrestling with the idea of how we manage the biodiversity in those areas. who has a say? There is a school of thought that says that in any basin of water, the countries that border around the edge will have a say. But that doesn't necessarily follow. I mean, you could say that Australia equally has a stake in the high seas in the middle of the Atlantic, as do Britain or Ireland or the US or Canada or Iceland or whomever. How do we stop the fishing there? Because there's fishing that goes on that's beyond, it's in the high seas, it's high seas fishing. How do we stop deep sea mining there, or at least control or regulate, maybe not stop? And this also ties into Antarctica, because the only place on Earth that is beyond the sovereign jurisdiction of any one country is Antarctica. So that's the other side of Antarctica, is it is also area beyond national jurisdiction. So no one person can say to anybody else, you can't do this in this continent. And in fact, if you're to distill it down, it's probably that I like the high seas and I like Antarctica simply because there's nobody that can tell me what to do down there.
Yeah, so much of this exploration around human interaction with the wilderness is an exploration of what is the human spirit. What is it that governs us?
It's much more about integrity. It's much more about self-management than it is about what somebody would choose to do. And you could probably translate that into your own life too, that if nobody was watching, would you still be as disciplined or as rigorous or as law-abiding? That there is a whole debate of if you could get away with it guaranteed, what would you do? Well, the same could be said of these places in terms of wilderness.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's a question we often ask at the Rooted Healing gatherings, is if you had if you didn't have to be anyone, you had nothing to do, nowhere to be, and no social structures telling you what's right and wrong, what would you be doing? Really deconstructing the molds we've grown into.
I think that's a very interesting question. And I guess the question maybe related to that is, and would you be willing to share it? Because that is very personal. Maybe that's a little bit of what people feel when they go to the Antarctic.
Would you like to share a little bit about your expedition ship that you're putting together that's about to launch?
Yes, I work for a Norwegian company called Viking. And so that this doesn't come across as some marketing spin, ships of opportunity typically are commercial vessels that then have a secondary role. So they support maybe some surveillance or monitoring or some scientific work. For many years, I have personally been very interested in the interface between those that would like to pay to go to wild places and to those that need information from wild places in order to manage them better. We have, during lockdown, it's been very surreal, looking in front of our computer screens for the last 2 years, worked and built 2 ships that are setting out to do precisely that. If we had to distill it down, it's how do you sincerely undertake scientific research at the same time as sincerely provide an amazing experience for our guests that are paying to be in these remote places. Yeah, we're on the cusp of that. It's very exciting. It feels like an opus of everything I've been wanting to do previously is now being expressed. And, ask me in a few months, I'll tell you how it's going.
Well, it sounds incredible. And yeah, I look forward to hearing how that all goes over the coming months. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really wonderful to sit with you and hear your perspective, hear your stories from under the ice. And yeah, if you'd like to just close us off with any final words, feel free.
I encourage all to embrace the wilderness. It's in whatever your wilderness is.
Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. If you would like to explore more deeply the teachings that come from these expeditions into Antarctica and other wild places, there is an archive of free content featuring Damon sharing insight and expertise at Viking.tv. However, this conversation is not affiliated with Viking. I better be clear on that. The relevant links are in the show notes, and if you're enjoying the Rooted Healing podcast, please do rate, review, download this episode, as this all really helps us, especially in these early stages. The music in this episode is Navajo Winds and Lichens by Mike Howe, and more of Dorrie Joy's tracks Herbs from her collection 13 Secrets woven in because I just loved it so much in our last episode with her. To find out more about Rooted Healing, visit rootedhealing.org and follow us on social media at rooted_healing. We have a magical, life-affirming, intimate gathering coming up in Mexico called Soul Medicine, which celebrates ceremonial healing, ritual, jungle immersion, dance, song, and deeply rooted community. You can find out more at rootedhealing.org/soulmedicine. Maybe you can also consider becoming a patron from as little as £1 a month in exchange for exclusive content, which will help us continue with this podcast. Visit patreon.com/rootedhealing to sign up. I would love to know how these episodes are landing with you, so please do feel free to share on social media or send us a message. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thank you for listening.